Let's be brutally honest right now. That's a big question.
I'm looking for someone who doesn't want to go to base camp, but they want to go to the very top.
Whether it's here, India, New York.
Civilization was born at happy hour.
That's what wins. That's what stands out. That's what people are interested in. That's what I want to know. The Hospopreneurs Podcast with James Henderson. Hello and welcome to episode 117 of the Hospopreneurs Podcast. Lachlan Campbell, the co-founder and CEO of ProAgni, an antibiotic-free animal feed supplement company, joins me for an episode that opens conversation on the economics of animal food and what he's doing to make a difference in the industry. Lachlan grew up on the family sheep farm in Australia and has decades of experience in livestock production and farm management as a specialist consultant advising hundreds of family farming businesses on planning and long-term sustainability. On his mission to improve farm economics, Lachlan is an active contributor and guide to the sheep and cattle industries and a corporate and government advisor. Hello and welcome to the show, Lachlan.
Hi James, how are you?
Very well, thank you. Very well. Thank you for joining me today. It's going to be an interesting and insightful interview, I am absolutely certain. We've had a couple of chats before this one and finally managed to line up a time together. So thank you very much for joining me on the program today. As you know, the first question that I like to ask on the show is a crazy hospitality story or exceptional hospitality experience, which the last couple of interviews I've been giving guests the option. So I thought I'd give you the option with that one as well. Which one do you want to take?
The last, James.
Yeah, exceptional hospitality experience. Please, fire away.
My exceptional hospitality experience took place in the States. We'd arrived after many hours of travel, late at night into our hotel, hadn't been fed and were really quite disorientated. The people greeted us, took our bags, walked us into the restaurant, sat us down with 2 steaks. I don't know why they thought we were country boys, and all we had to ask for was a beer. That was exceptional service.
They just knew.
They just knew.
They just could sense it. Where did you say that was?
That was at LA. It was just near the airport. 2 tired Aussie travellers about to depart home, but we had to stay overnight to catch the early morning flight. So, yeah, it was a nice way to leave the States.
Fantastic. Was that the last time you were there?
It was, in fact, yeah, before COVID hit.
What a nice way to, or memory of the US. Hopefully things do change quickly and you can make it back there soon enough. And I know that you've got some interesting plans with ProAgni and the US. So I would love to get into that a little bit more if you're happy sharing on the program today.
Of course.
Thank you firstly for sharing that exceptional hospitality experience. It is definitely exceptional and definitely a hospitality experience. The question I like to ask next is around why you do what you do. Fundamentally, what I'm trying to understand is ultimately what really drives you beyond what it is that you actually do. And you come from a background that is not the norm with farmers, and you do have that in you, and I would love to sort of pull that apart and let our listeners know your background. So you've got a few different elements in there that have then brought you to do what you do today. So tell us about that.
Let's start with the last part first. I'm a 5th generation sheep and cattle farmer from Central West New South Wales, educated in Sydney and went on to become a banker and went, well, I'm not sure what life would look like when I was 40 or 50, so I jumped out of banking and left for the farm and quickly became a consultant. I was a consultant for about 18 years. And then as a result of a really interesting experience that one of my business partners, Rob Bell, had back in September of 2015, where he went to a conference to listen to a particular gentleman by the name of Professor Athol Cleve talk about kangaroos and the fact that kangaroos are special in 3 very different ways. They emit very little methane. They require little or no grass relative to sheep and cattle, and they've done this for over 20 million years with no antibiotics. And as a result of that interaction, Rob and I jumped on a plane to meet Athol at the university before he retired. The reality is we had come across some stranded science, and the stranded science, for several reasons. It was just bad timing. The university had run out of money. Climate change wasn't a big priority in Tony Abbott's agenda. And so the funding left his research. But as a result of that conversation, we identified that if we could commercialise some technology, we had the ability to dramatically reduce methane emissions from sheep and cattle, in particular in feedlots. We had the ability to reduce the amount of grass and the amount of water animals required to put on 1 kilo of red meat. And I'll get back to that as to why it's important in a minute and to what kangaroos do. And the third one is we had the ability to reduce agriculture's contribution to the risk around antimicrobial resistance. Because if we could do what we wanted to do, and if we could do what we set ourselves out to do, we could actually take non-therapeutic antibiotics out of the red meat food chain. Now, that was nearly 5 years ago, and we've come an extraordinary way in achieving those goals.
Wonderful. Before you tell us more about kangaroos and red meat, what sits behind that? Thank you for sharing a bit more about your story there, because that was part of the question, was a massive question there. What sits behind what it is that you do? Why ultimately do you do what you do?
Farmers over the 20 years that I've been involved in ag, or probably a little bit longer, and a lot of it as a consultant, they deal with very low margins and often in times of drought. So when you've got poor seasons where there's no grass, low prices, then over time, what you're actually observing with farmers is the slow destruction of wealth. And this is a part of our community and our environment where it's expected that we produce food that's abundant, that is affordable, and that it's clean. And so the farmers are faced with those challenges every day of the week. And that's probably one of the real reasons I got started, is that this technology would hopefully enable farmers to be able to do those things, maintain their wealth, maintain their balance sheets, but at the same time deliver to the world affordable, clean and abundant protein.
Fantastic. Thank you for quickly touching on that one. Tell us now more about kangaroos and red meat and how you've used that to build what you're doing now.
James, if I could just ask you to think about a paddock anywhere in Australia, such as my place, where I've got in one paddock, I've got a whole bunch of kangaroos and I've got a whole bunch of sheep, or I've got a whole bunch of cattle. Now, the kangaroos can sit under a tree in the middle of a hot summer and they put on weight. And we use an expression called a feed conversion ratio, but what it actually really just describes is how much grass that animal requires to put on 1 kilo of red meat. And a kangaroo can, in those really trying times, use about 4 and 6 kilos of grass to put on 1 kilo of red meat. My sheep or my cattle, to put on that same kilo, will take between 15 and 25 kilos of grass to put on the same kilo of red meat. So quite quickly, you're using almost 5 times the amount of resources to do effectively the same thing. Now, there's a couple of reasons for that. And I'm not saying for a moment that kangaroos and cattle are similar, but they do have a similar digestive process, and they draw their energy from the way they break down the grass in the gut to draw off what we call volatile fatty acids. Now, macropods have had 20 million years to do this. Sheep and cattle have had about 200. So when you give it that kind of head start, the gut biome in the kangaroo has actually evolved to live in this environment. Our sheep and cattle haven't. And so one of the questions probably asked itself is, well, what would the world look like if sheep and cattle could do the same thing? Now, I don't mean for a moment that we're actually going to try and grab the gut biome of kangaroos and put them into sheep and cattle. That science is not even yet tested. But what we are saying is, how does this work? What's available to us? What's hidden in plain sight inside the rumen? And what technology can we use to change and manipulate the digestive system of our sheep and cattle so that we optimize those microbes in the gut? And as a result of that, what ends up happening that we found out through our research and our work is that you're turning waste products such as methane and they're being reabsorbed. Not all of them. Methane is a great way of measuring inefficiency in a rumen. So it's the exhaust pipe, and cattle and sheep burp it out the front end. But if you can reabsorb some of that methane and reabsorb some of the harmful bacteria and turn it into energy, the first thing that happens is you get healthier animals. The second thing is that you get more efficient food production. And the third is you get a smaller environmental footprint. And that's why we started.
Wonderful. There's a lot in there. I'm interested to know what your journey has been. Tell us a bit about the time frame that's been over as well, in terms of actually banding together and your story as a founder. I'm interested to know there, because we touched a bit on the science that intrigued you first and then meeting the scientist behind it before he retired. How did that evolve into ProAgni? How did you start the business, find your partners, that side of the story?
Rob Bell, who identified this really special opportunity, is a nutritional consultant. He's been a nutritional consultant to my family for quite a few years preceding this journey and the start of this journey. And he's turned out to be one of my co-founders and one of my close friends. And Rob saw this as the opportunity. But when you're meeting with the likes of Professor Athol Cleave, you're talking about a rock star here. And it took quite a bit of work for us to jump on a plane. He met Athol August or September of 2015. It took to about November before we worked up the courage to go up there and see him. And he turns out to be just a beautiful human being. And then we got home and we were completely mesmerised by this opportunity. But just because it's an idea doesn't make it a viable business. And the third original founder, Fiona Salisbury, who I'd worked with us in a consultancy environment and who was also a close friend of Rob's, we approached her in the February and said, listen, we've come up with this opportunity. We've come up with something that we think might dramatically change the way we do things. And we're thinking of starting a business. Would you like to be involved? Now, Fiona is not only been working in agribusiness for over 20 years, she's also got a degree in nuclear science and she's also got an MBA in professional accounting. So in terms of the skill set that we needed, we had a pretty good start. The first thing you've got to do when you start this is to work out how long it'll take you to commercialise this opportunity. And of course, we thought it'd only take about 6 to 8 months. It'd be easy. There'd be revenues of gold within 12 months.
Which is, very rarely the case.
It couldn't have been further from the truth.
Mm.
So one of the first things we actually had to understand is the science. And with Fiona and Rob, that was definitely part of the greatest journey. And it was really understanding what that science looked like and then understanding the problem we were trying to solve. And we're trying to solve 3 separate problems, but not with all the same pieces of technology. And one of the first things that we thought we could solve with some reasonable ease is the use of wanton antibiotics, or we call them ionophores. It's the industrial name for antibiotics in feedlots. And they get fed out to sheep and cattle while they're in a feedlot on a daily basis. And we went, what if we could take those out? But what if we could take them out without blowing up the economics of feedlotting, because it's a low margin business? And what if we could do it without disrupting or asking farms to change the way they do it or pay more for the use of our product? So that was the first journey. That was about developing a prebiotic that went to market that was essentially a switch out, nothing to see here for the farmers. It was the same inclusion rate, it was the same bag size, but the major difference was that it didn't contain any form of antibiotics and it performed at least as good as our competitors and was priced significantly cheaper. And so that was really where we started to cut our teeth commercially. That was launched about 18 months ago. And without any branding and marketing, I think we've fed nearly 600,000 animals. And this was just asking a favour from a reseller in Dubbo. So Rob and I went to this reseller. Reseller's the guy where you buy your agricultural produce from inside a town. So you drive up in a ute and you go, look, I need 5 bags of X and can you throw in a bag of dog biscuits? And so we went to one of these guys and said, we need a favour. Can you just see what this might look like with some of your customers who are also close friends of ours? And that's really how the journey started.
Handy to already have that available as well. You've grown up in that environment as well. So it sounds like you already had all the skills, all the pieces to finish the puzzle, really. You just needed time on your side there as well. So you said 18 months ago. What does the picture look like for you now?
I think what we've got now are 2 really large pieces of the puzzle. We've got what we call a prebiotic, which is the stuff that goes into feedlots as we speak, and that goes a long way to solving all the problems regarding antimicrobial resistance and the use of those compounds in our feeding system. But the second part of the technology, and this is the really cool stuff, this is why we met Professor Cleave, this is why we flew to the university, is about the probiotic. The probiotic is about grabbing some really difficult bugs. They're called obligate anaerobes. They can't tolerate oxygen. They're so sensitive that if you were to take all the oxygen out of a room but put them on a Petri dish where inside the Petri dish, inside the glass, there was a little bit of oxygen, you'd kill all these bugs. What we had to do was grab those bugs and then be able to grow them out, freeze dry them, make them shelf stable, and then reanimate them in the rumen at the right numbers to do the job we asked those bugs to do. These are naturally occurring bugs in sheep and cattle. But the trick with this is the shelf is the removal of the cold chain storage, but also the reanimation. So essentially what you're doing here is trying to get the right bug in the right place, in the right number, at the right time.
So for someone like myself and for listeners out there who don't know what reanimation means, sounds like you're bringing that inactive thing back to life. So what does that actually mean?
In order to remove cold chain storage, you've got to freeze dry these little guys at around about minus 40 degrees C. You've got to snap freeze them. Now you kill out most of them, but we do know there are a big enough percentage that live through that process. So when you actually then put them into the stomach of a rumen, you are then watching these little guys grow quickly. And we're talking in the space of 20 minutes. And you've got to get them up to the right number to do the job we ask. And inside a feedlot, for instance, when you take sheep or cattle into a feedlot and you're taking them from grass to grain, animals aren't designed to eat grain. They're not designed to eat large amounts of barley or wheat. In fact, if they do, you run the really real risk of killing them. So we call that process the induction process. It takes it between 14 and 21 days. It is the most expensive and it's the most dangerous part of feedlotting. It's the time where you run the risk of killing animals or at least permanently damaging their stomach. And that's because grain ferments. And when grain ferments, it produces a compound called lactic acid. Lactic acid, it burns the stomach. Now, unless you've got bugs in there to consume that lactic acid quickly, then you will do permanent damage to the animal. Now, that process slowed down. It means the animal can adapt, the population builds up inside the rumen, and then you've got this feedlotting process starting to, by day 28, the animals are acclimatised and everything's fine. Now, our bugs, we know if you get them in the animal straight away, we can reduce that time down to 3 days. That is a game changer for feedlotting. When you're talking an industry that relies on really small margins, high turnover, it's a bit like a restaurant, James, where a restaurant, if they have 2 or 3 sittings a night, it's been a good night. But if they could have a 4th sitting, that 4th sitting represents almost total profit, pure profit. That's one of the big game changers. And at the same time, you do this without the use of antibiotics in the process.
Fantastic. I'm interested to know, Lachlan, what you're learning about or exploring at the moment. So what is it that you're pushing forward? Where are you innovating?
I think the biggest area for us is really around, there's 2 major drivers that get ProAgni out of bed every Monday morning. And the first is the debate and the contribution that farm animals make to greenhouse gas emissions and in particular methane. Now, if we can actually, through this technology, reduce that, we do 2 things. We reduce our footprint, our environmental footprint. But that inefficiency we were talking about before, think of it as an exhaust pipe. The less methane they produce, the less water they require, the less grass they require. So you're actually making it a more efficient process, but you're also not adding to climate change. Now, this technology has application not only in Western agriculture, but in emerging markets. And in emerging markets where we're seeing the destruction of rainforests for agriculture and for clearing to produce grass or grain that goes straight into these feedlots. Stopping that is in itself something that we think is really important.
Lachlan, I want to ask you a little bit more about the capital raise you're going through at the moment. Can you tell us about where you guys are at and what you're looking for as well?
As any startup, and you can imagine this is as soon as we got some sense of the opportunity here, as soon as we got some sense of what we thought we'd need. And this is my first rodeo. This is my first time as a founder. And we brought on a guy called Warren Lee to help us with that. And Warren's got a background in law and mergers and acquisitions. He was a former director of a VC company, and he's also a close friend of mine. And so he came on and said, look, the first thing you're going to need to do is raise some money as a convertible note. That will give us enough time to work out how big this market is, how long it's going to take to get to this market, and what it's going to cost us to get to the market. So we went to family and friends, and I think we raised about $1.6 million. And we did it in 3 episodes. It took us about a week to 10 days every time. And interestingly enough, I thought that was quite normal. But Warren said that's some of the fastest capital raises he's ever seen. And it's because people understood the problem. And you bring kangaroos into this and bring the opportunity that around the thinking of this biomimicry and what we can do to actually change the world and be a profitable business at the same time. It's almost a no-brainer. And so we were excited. Our investors were excited. And so that's essentially the first component part of our capital raise. And that then got us to allow us to start building the business model around those questions I put before. And that's when we started the journey around our capital raise. And now we've started that. We had a guy who saw us. We did, I think, called Pitch in the Paddock in, I think, September of 2018 at Rockhampton. And we won that. And part of that day was with an ag professional who was a leader in the industry. And he said, come down to Sydney, meet with me. Let's really start to unpack this. And by the end of the day, I think we left a fairly strong impression on him because he walked away and he said, I want to take the entire Series A. And as a result of that, it gave us a bit of time. That, just to be clear on that, we're still in the process of completing that, and we believe we're going to be completed in the next 2 to 3 weeks. But the reality around it is that not only have we got an opportunity here, that this technology has very immediate application in the United States. So the whole idea of defining what our total addressable market was very quick. And I think that's where we said, this is what we think we need. This is what we think the business is worth. And he said, I've got absolutely no problem with the way you've defined that, and let's get going. So hopefully in the next 2 or 3 weeks that completes.
Fantastic. And just so listeners know, this is we're currently recording this in mid-August 2020. So good luck for the next couple of weeks, but this will come out long after that happens. I'm sure that we'll look back when listeners hear this episode, and things will be excellent for you, Lachlan. And things have been going really well for you throughout that process, Lachlan. There's actually a company that's been watching what you've been doing, and you are now named in another list. Do you want to tell us about what that list is?
We've been able to become one of the finalists at Future Food Asia, which is due to start, I think, later in September. And we've got to pitch virtually, unfortunately, because of COVID. We've got to pitch for first prize, and first prize is, I believe, $100,000 US. So it's a really significant competition. I'm delighted we got that far. I'm delighted we're starting to get both the commercial affirmation that we've been seeking, but also we've clearly got a reputation for the quality of our products. Whether we win or not, and he's not going to knock back $100,000, but the point is the fact that we got there. And the point is that this small little startup 5 years ago is now being recognised for its opportunity and its contribution to agriculture.
Absolutely. And you mentioned there about the US as well. Obviously, it's a much larger market than Australia, but Australia, being an agricultural economy, is an excellent place to test a product and business like yours. What trajectory are you looking at for the future of ProAgni?
If I could, James, I just want to take you back to the history of feedlotting in both Australia and the US.
For sure.
They've arrived from different places. Feedlotting in Australia is relatively opportunistic. So when we have dry seasons, feedlots open up, and it's done really to help mitigate drought. It's done to either capture the stock that are currently on the grass and get them off the grass and put them somewhere so they can finish quicker to just get them off the farm. And so that cost of production is very different. The cost of grain's much higher in Australia. So Australian feedlotters are some of the best in the world. In America, feedlotting is really an output of the grain industry, and in particular maize. So it's one of the really easy ways to add value to maize and the maize industry. So the way they go about that is that corn's grown in the US and it's grown in abundance. It's grown right through the Midwest. Now, when that grain's harvested, a lot of it goes to distillers and it's turned into alcohol, but not all of it. And even then, the byproduct from distillers then goes back into the feedlot industry. So the feedlot industry is essentially a great way of capturing that waste and capturing that grain. So as a result, around about 95%, and might even be higher, around about 95% of all meat grown, or the meat you might eat in a restaurant in the United States, has come from a feedlot. In Australia, it's somewhere between 45 and 65%, and it varies depending on the season and depending on where you are in Australia. So feedlotting in America is the go-to way as to how protein's produced, and Americans are big meat eaters, and the feedlots run for a long time. So animals stay in there for anywhere between 350 and 450 days, depending on the market they're selling to. So it's culturally very different as well.
That supports that Australia is excellent ground for you to be testing in, because it means that there's less risk on the outcome of the industry as well. So the people who take that upon themselves to do so, and then you could have obviously your market's larger and you have a greater impact. So if it works here, then that's an excellent position to be in for the US. So that's fantastic to hear as well, Lachlan. I'm interested in trying to understand a little more around some of the other innovations that have occurred with animal feed. What have you been looking to, and is there other comparisons that you can make that have occurred along the way in your study of the industry?
I think there is a race at the moment to work out this methane emission issue with ag, and in particular with cattle and open grazing. So seaweed has become a very strong talking point. Just recently, one of the big commercial grocery retailers decided to invest heavily in that technology. So it's a very strong message to the market that we've not only got to produce affordable food with abundance, but we've actually got to clean up our act, and we've actually got to get greener. And when we first started this journey, no one really knew the issue regarding ionophores in feed. That's changed. And in 2022, Europe will ban the use of all animals that have been fed any type of antibiotic during their lifetime in feeding. I think one of the things we're starting to see is the supply chain is no longer naive to what customers want. And we use the term, know what your food eats. And that is, customers are demanding to know the provenance of their food. They're demanding to know where the animals come from, what it's been fed, and its environmental footprint. And social license is given to people, and I know it's an expression used really frequently, but our industry's been given that social license, and we run the risk of losing it if we don't attend to these needs. And I think they're easily attended to. I think we've got a huge opportunity both in Australia and the world to do this well and to do it better.
Lachlan, in doing what you're doing, what is something that you're experiencing great friction around? Is there something that you're dealing with that is a huge challenge that you're trying to overcome? Or it could even be a small thing that just isn't quite doing what you want it to do. Maybe it's sociological, maybe it's economic, maybe it's psychological. Is there something that you're experiencing at the moment that's frictional?
I think there's probably three component parts, or really three balls that are always in the air of a startup and land directly with the founders. The first is you're in the market to raise capital and you don't know when that's going to finish, and it is a hard journey. It is very hard in Australia, but it's hard. You've got to get your pitch right. You've got to understand that no doesn't mean I don't like you. It just means I'm not interested. So the raising capital issue is always front and center. And then the second part is the iteration process, knowing who your customer is, finding out who your customer is, understanding what the minimum viable product is. And that took us quite a lot of time, and it's still not there. And then working out what those channels to market might look like, because you don't have a lot of money. You've got to use collaborative relationships. You've got to use high leverage impact points. You've got to be able to negotiate well and be prepared to understand that while you're not always going to keep 100% of the margin, but you're going into environments where you're the new kid on the block. This has been done before, and the people that you're often talking to are very experienced at doing it. And so there's that sense of knowing what to do next in those environments, being humble, being considerate, understanding the difference between when you're negotiating process and content and how to do that well. And that's been a wonderful journey for all of us. And then the third component part about the business is managing the people, because you've actually asked everybody associated with ProAgni to hang on with their fingernails while we go from a cash burn to being revenue positive. And that's a big ask. Everybody has taken an extraordinary amount of risk, both at a financial level, but also at a reputational level. In fact, they've all jumped off their professions to actually do this, including myself. And while I'm still part of a family farm, and while my brother is still my business partner, he has been for 27 years, I'm no longer part of the operational side of the business. And if things were to tip over with ProAgni, I don't think he'd want me back. In fact, I'm sure he wouldn't want me back. He tells me the business has never been better. We understand that when you do this, you've essentially burnt all your boats. You've got to just keep going. And some days are harder than others, and some days are really easy. And last week was a great example for us. We just received confirmation that the patent for our prebiotic had been granted in Australia. So we are novel and different. The stuff we produce is legitimately unique. That's great. That's a huge shot in the arm. And it matters to investors.
Yes, absolutely. And you make some incredible points there that there's a huge risk associated with these things. And listeners will be well aware of these sorts of things: reputational risk, financial risk, and possibly more, especially when you're dealing with food if done incorrectly as well. So there's a lot at stake. And it also tells those three things that you explained there is telling of what sort of stage you are at in the business development too. And you're talking about something that you're 5 years in. There's obviously still more to go, and you're going through that process at the moment. You're in the weeds. Absolutely good luck to you through this time. It is the most challenging part in many ways, and it's interesting hearing your experience at the moment. And thank you for sharing your personal experiences there. I actually only have a couple more questions for you today. And the second last, or the penultimate question is ultimately, where do you want to be? What does success look like for ProAgni? I know that there are a lot of things happening, and if you raise enough that you hit the goals that you want to raise, maybe you raise more, maybe you don't raise as much as you wanted. If you just build at a sort of rate and continue to grow and hit the milestones that you want to hit, what does success look like for ProAgni?
James, if I could just unpack that in a couple of ways. The first is, if we want to talk about what does success look like at a commercial level and where does ProAgni see itself in the next 3 to 5 years, I think that the vision of the business is to be a profound influencer in the way animals are fed, to do it better, to do it with the affordability that we've got now, and to de-risk that for both ourselves and for our farmers. But at a personal level, I wouldn't swap this for quids. I think this part of the journey, this really hard graft, is something that I've immersed myself in. I love it. It's not always easy, but there'll be a point where I'll look back on this and wish for it because you're alive. How many people get to do this? I'm living my vision. I mean, how many people get to find something that can actually commercially be very successful, really change and make a step change to the world, and at the same time be on a journey with people I deeply admire, profoundly trust, and learn more about as we face the challenges we've had. And we've had those challenges and we tend to work it out. You're on a bit of an Apollo mission to the moon. Once you start, you can't turn around.
100%. And you are preaching to the converted on that one as well. You do have to be a little bit crazy to be on this particular journey, and listeners, many of them are in that same sort of boat. So thank you, Lachlan, as well. I know that it'll be reflected when people listen back to what you're saying.
Thank you.
So you're unpacking that question there as well. Do you have some more around ultimately what success looks like for ProAgni?
I think what we observe in the startup world is that you innovate easily and quickly because you've got to pivot. It isn't a business that needs to actually seek permission to change the way we're developing a product or to change the pathway by which we then go down. Now, that makes us very agile. And as a result of that, we tend to work stuff out a lot quicker. Now, that means that it makes it really attractive when we've solved some problems, wrap them up in a bow. And if we're talking about the commercial success here, it really, I think, reflects about what the liquidity event might look like for ProAgni. And I think there's, two that are front and center for us. And the first is that at some point, if we wanted to raise even more capital at far larger amounts at far faster, then I think there is that opportunity to list and go public. But I think the greater likelihood with commercial success for us will probably be around the existing big pharma businesses that don't have an answer to this and go, look, it's just easier to buy ProAgni because they've done it. They've got those solutions sorted. They know where their market is. And this is now just about scalability. And they've got a distribution network and model that would take years if we ever got there. And I think that's probably where we probably would finish our journey as founders. Whether we'd all then continue on, that's up to the individuals.
Lachlan, I have one last question for you today, and that is, who would you like to hear on the show?
For me, someone like McDonald's or Costco, where they're facing this at the pointy end, where their customers are going, we want this stuff out, and how are they responding to it? Even how someone like the CEO of Coles is managing this issue, and where do they see their business in the next 3 to 5 years, given the pressures that are not only coming from their customers in terms of price, but delivering food with the frequency and the consistency that Australian consumers are so used to. And it's a huge challenge for all of us.
Wonderful. Thank you very much for joining me today on the program. Lachlan, it's been a pleasure having you on.
James, thank you for your time. It's been a pleasure being here.
This program is hosted by James Henderson, with technical production by Jake Olver. Voiceovers were by Angus Brennan and Shim Phelan. Thanks to our distribution team, and a special thanks to you for tuning in every week. This program was produced by H Media. We'll see you soon.
Is there anything that you don't want me to bring up in the interview?
My batting average. That'll do.
Okay, copy that. No batting averages.